I knew I was going to hate it the moment I walked through that door. The cramped entrance hall was already thick with the musty smell of old carpet. I kicked off my boots and stepped into the living room bedroom hybrid, soaking in the depression that seemed to emanate from every corner. The ancient Soviet-style furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, as if just breathing near it for too long would cause it to crumble into dust. The wallpaper was likely intended to be beige. Maybe it even was at some point, but now it had this burnt, orange tint to it, like the inside of a microwave that hadn't been cleaned in ages. A pair of floral curtains draped over the singular large window tried their best to inject some life into the room. Unfortunately, the only thing they succeeded at was making everything else look even duller by contrast. Alexsei didn't have to ask me for my opinion. My expression probably spoke for itself. He reiterated that this was just short-term, a month or two at most, and we would be moving to his actual place in Moscow as soon as the renovations were done. That's where I thought we'd be living when I agreed to move to Russia with him. But then his apartment got flooded just a day before I was scheduled to arrive. Talk about rotten luck. He did everything he could to find us a place under the circumstances. So I wasn't upset with him, but I wasn't exactly jumping for joy either. Our temporary abode apparently used to belong to his best friend's grandma. You could really tell. It was located in what's called a crushivokua, which, from what I understand, is basically the old-school version of the stereotypical commie block. Considering those are already viewed as outdated, you can only imagine what living in its predecessor is like. I guess if you grew up in one, it might not seem so bad. But going from a Canadian suburb to a concrete box in the middle of whatever the Eastern European equivalent of a ghetto is was quite the whiplash. Hey, we've got to make the best of the hand we're dealt, right? I told my boyfriend with what I hoped was a comforting grin. As much as I hated it, and I really fucking hated it, I didn't want him to feel guilty over something he couldn't have possibly anticipated. Just a small bump in the road, I kept telling myself. Soon, everything would be back on track. The first few days were uneventful, almost business as usual. Alexsei would leave early in the morning to catch the train to Moscow for work, while I settled into my regular routines. I often became so engrossed in my projects that my surroundings faded into the background, at least until I finally put the laptop down and wanted to grab something from the fridge, only to be reminded that, well, we didn't have one. Not a working one. Anyway, we actually stored our food out on the balcony. It was early January, so it was definitely cold enough for that. The only other option was using the communal fridge, but I wasn't a fan of my cheesecake tasting like onion and pickles. I want to say that the place started to grow on me, but honestly it didn't. Even putting aside the lack of basic amenities, there was just something off about it. It was way too quiet. I expected to hear some movement in the hallway or maybe someone blasting their TV a bit too loud to now. The usual apartment stuff, but nope. The building was dead silent, to the point where I sometimes wondered if I was the only one living there during the day. I knew for a fact I wasn't alone, though, because every time, and I do mean every time, I stepped out to the shops or just to stretch my legs, there was always this middle-aged guy standing by the door to the shared basement, just staring at it. He looked a bit rough around the edges, but definitely didn't come off as crazy or on drugs or anything like that. He just seemed exhausted, his dark eyes carrying a vacant look as if this was some chore he was stuck doing. We'd exchange nods, and then he would go right back to staring at the old metal door with its chipping blue paint. It was odd at first, then started to become creepy, and then went right back to being one of those things that you just don't think too much about. After all, he wasn't hurting anyone, nor was he being weird toward me. Who was I to question a man's passion for door watching? I didn't bring him up to Alexsei. He could be a bit too overprotective sometimes. I didn't want him starting any drama with the neighbors on my behalf, especially since we weren't going to be staying there for long anyway. I'm not sure if he noticed the strange man whenever he'd come home in the evenings. If he did, he never mentioned it. After about 2 weeks of the same old routine, something changed. I threw on my coat, wrapped myself in a scarf, and headed out to do some shopping as usual. But as I was going down the stairs, I noticed that the man was now on the second floor, staring intently at some other resident's door. He nodded at me like he always did, but this time, I didn't nod back. All of a sudden, in this new context, his favorite pastime seemed a lot more concerning. I have no idea what made me decide to confront him on my own. Maybe because he looked like an especially scrawny guy, and I figured I could handle him in a struggle if it came to that. My Russian isn't perfect, and I managed to ask him what he was up to. He responded rather matter-of-factly with something along the lines of, "Watching the garden grow." I blinked. I'm not sure what kind of answer I expected. However, it sure as hell wasn't that. I decided to just back off and ask Alexsei what the man could have possibly meant when he came home later. Maybe it was some local expression that only made sense if you're a native speaker. But then, true to form, bad luck struck once again. Alexsei called me that same afternoon to let me know his sister had been in a car wreck and they were currently at the hospital. He said she was stable, but he wasn't sure when he'd be able to make it back. Naturally, I put on my best sympathetic girlfriend voice, assuring him I could manage on my own for a few days. Inside, though, I was panicking over the idea of being stuck there alone. "You sure?" He kept probing. "I could try to get someone to drive over there and—" "Yes, I'll be fine. I'm a big girl. I can take care of myself. You do what you have to do. I'm not going anywhere," I'd insist, desperately hoping that the mask wouldn't slip. Or maybe, on some level, wishing that it would. Being by myself in that claustrophobic hellhole during the day was one thing, but when the sun went down it became a whole different story. A silence, once eerie, now became utterly suffocating. Every little bump had me jolting out of my makeshift blanket fort and racing to switch on the lights, terrified that there was someone at the door trying to pick the lock. It was an irrational fear, but knowing that didn't make it feel any less real at the time. We were on the 5th and top floor, so at least I didn't have to worry about anyone climbing in through the window. Although, in hindsight, I guess it wasn't technically impossible. Whenever I had to venture out, I made sure to slip past that strange man as quickly as I could. Just to stare alone was enough to make my stomach turn. Worse, after a few days, he had moved up a floor and was now lurking around the 3rd. As a result of not getting enough quality sleep, I began having sleep paralysis. If you've never had it before, let me tell you, it fucking sucks. You're lying there, wide awake but completely unable to move, and it feels like there's a weight pressing down on your chest. You perceive shapes and figures superimposed upon your familiar surroundings, as if they have crossed the threshold from your nightmares and have followed you over into the real world. One of my most frequent episodes involved these pinkish red roots slowly creeping up the walls, writhing like giant larvae trying to burrow their way through flesh. They were the worst because, unlike some vague shadow creature, I could clearly see what they were. I could see their flesh-like texture. I could see each disgusting pulse as they squirmed their way along the corners and even up the ceiling, converging directly on top of me. When it was finally over, I would sit up in a cold sweat and just stare at my clammy hands for what felt like hours before the sun would eventually rise. At this point, you might be wondering why I decided to keep my boyfriend in the dark about what was going with me. One reason is that I didn't want him to stress over his spoiled, crybaby girlfriend's mini meltdowns when he had enough on his plate already. Truthfully, I also felt like telling him would somehow make everything I was going through real, somehow like saying it out loud would give it the acknowledgement it wanted. For both our sakes, I just had to tough it out. The quality of my work obviously took a nosedive. I was missing deadlines, making entry-level mistakes, and my supervisors were starting to get impatient. They were aware of my less than ideal living situation, and at the end of the day, our clients didn't care about any of that. I was forced to take some mandatory time off, which in corporate terms means you're basically on thin ice. This was probably the worst outcome, as it left me with nothing to do but wallow in my own delusions. Day and night started to blur together. I binged every TV show I could think of, just so I didn't have to be alone with my thoughts, all the while assuring Alexsei that I was doing fine whenever he called to check in on me. Sometimes, I wasn't sure if he actually called or if I had just dreamt our conversations. Maybe he had forgotten about me. Maybe he had left me to rot there, so my decaying body could serve as compost for whatever those growths were. The roots had made their way to my bed now, crawling out from under it, tugging at my sheets, lapping around me like a throbbing cocoon. The worst part was that I stopped being scared. I just learned to accept my role as fertilizer, as soil for which their seeds may sprout. The man was now on the 4th floor. I spotted him standing in the front of the apartment, directly below ours on my way up one morning. It was then that something in me officially snapped. I can only imagine how deranged I must have looked as I ran up to him, grabbed him by the sweater, and shook his entire bony frame while screaming in his face, demanding to know what the fuck he was really doing. His face remained blank. His thin lips formed a line of cold indifference, or maybe pity. With surprising strength, he pushed me away, adjusted his collar, tucked some imaginary strands of hair behind his bald head, turned around, and went right back to his staring. It was too much. I couldn't do this anymore. I ran upstairs and slammed our apartment door so hard that it rattled the window. In a frenzy, I dug through the mountain of dirty clothes piled on the bed for my phone, intending on calling Alexsei to just come and pick me up. But instead of the usual ringing tone, all I heard was the sound of wood snapping and scraping of a giant heart thumping in my ears. I looked down, and what I saw made me drop the phone. The roots were wrapped around my ankles, slowly pulling me down beneath the floorboards. I fought. I screamed. I pleaded. But it was no use. They bound my arms together. They pushed their way through my ears, through my eyes, licking at my brain. The pain was beyond anything I could describe. And then, I woke up in my bed, like I always did. The TV was still running in the background, casting shadows across the littered floor. I caught a glimpse of what I thought was a cockroach scuttling from one greasy microwave food container to another. I pressed my palms to my forehead. I needed fresh air. Desperately, I climbed out of bed and dragged my feet over to the balcony. As I pushed aside the curtains, however, I wasn't greeted by the usual view of the street. Roots throbbing and sinews snaked across the outside of my window, squirming as they blotted out every last sliver of daylight. They were pressing against the glass, causing small cracks to form that turned into bigger ones, until they finally came spilling in like a crimsonide, sweeping me up and enveloping me whole. And then, I woke up in my bed. Or maybe it was the bathroom floor this time. Roots slithered from between cracks in the tiles, and the ceiling was a grotesque tapestry of tumorous growths. What looked like red mushrooms were growing out of the shower drain. I stood up and walked over to the sink. My reflection stared back at me dully. There, inside one eye, a sprout began to unfurl as it tried to push its way through my iris. The pressure inside my skull was too much to bear. I leaned back and smashed my head against the porcelain, again and again, creating an opening for the roots to surge free. They erupted, twisting together into a second head molded from pulsating meat. It smiled at me, not a sinister smile, but the kind a mother would give her child, letting it know that everything was going to be okay now. And then, I woke up in my bed, like I always did. These sort of cycles would play out for what sometimes felt like days at a time. I couldn't really tell the difference between sleep and reality anymore. Maybe there never was a difference. Maybe or maybe, and more likely, I was just going crazy. If that was the case, I figured I might as well get to the bottom of the insanity, both figuratively and literally. The basement door loomed before me, suddenly far more intimidating than the countless times I'd walked past it. Looking up at its tall frame caused a sinking feeling in my gut. I had a piece of metal clutched in my hand, ready to serve as an improvised crowbar if needed. But to my surprise, the door swung open with just the slightest nudge. I don't think it even had a working lock to begin it. I went down the creaking steps and into the darkness. The smell of neglect was more oppressive than ever, along with this sour, vinegary stench that made my nostrils burn. My fingers grazed the wall, brushing away cobwebs as I searched for a light switch. When I finally flicked it on, a solitary bulb flickered to life, casting a harsh spotlight down into the depths of the underground space. It was then that I noticed that the entire floor was alive. A carpet of red mold and winding vegetation stretched deep into the blackness. Those little specks dancing in the air weren't just dust, but tiny little spores, and I immediately became conscious of how much I was inhaling. I quickly covered my nose with my sleeve and pressed on, descending deeper into the gloom. There was practically no surface that didn't have some amount of mold growing on it, and there, propped against a wall, as though at the epicenter of the infestation, was a dead body. I froze, my makeshift hill clanking against the ground as I took in the sight. The figure was hardly recognizable as having been a person. The advanced state of decay hinted that it had been there for quite a bit. The head was slumped to one side, encased in thick mold that seemed to spread outward, while the face was unit and fightable. I recognized the torn sweater as belonging to that strange man. As horrifying of a realization as it might have been under normal circumstances, I also couldn't deny how peaceful he looked. resting there amidst his garden. The silence that I once dreaded now wrapped around me like a cozy blanket. I almost felt the urge to go over and lay beside him. Maybe I did do that, and now I'm just dreaming about writing this from Alexei's car while I wait for him to pack our stuff. He was so surprised when I told him that it actually wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be. I could totally see this place becoming our little getaway when life in overcrowded Moscow got too much. I guess it did end up growing on me. In a sense, grief is a slow poison. It seeps into the bones, into the marrow, and hollows you out from the inside. It had eaten away at me for years, stripping me down until all that remained was the desperate wish to rewrite my own story. And then I found a way. It began with late nights, scribbled calculations in the dim glow of my basement lamp, my fingers stained with ink, my breath shallow with anticipation. The machine was not elegant. It was a thing of wires and rust, a grotesque amalgamation of scavenged parts, old radios, gutted televisions, copper tubing twisted like veins of some mechanical beast. The core was the heart of it all, a pulsating, humming mess of stolen technology and my own crude attempts at innovation. It was ugly, but it was mine. At first, I told myself it was about science. I was proving something to the world, to myself. But deep down, I knew better. It was about them. My wife, my daughter, the ones I lost in a moment of senseless tragedy, a car swerving where it shouldn't have, a brief lapse of attention, the universe swallowing them whole and leaving me behind to rot in the silence of our home. Move an object, see if anything changed. I placed a watch on the opposite side of the table. When I returned, my past self was staring at it, confused, running a hand through his hair. It worked. Then came the next step. I traveled further, days at a time. I tested cause and effect like a child prodding at an anthill, watching the tiny lives scramble. I spoke to myself, whispered warnings, nudged fate in one direction or another, and every time I returned, reality was subtly different, a book misplaced, a conversation remembered differently, a headline that didn't match my memory. I should have stopped. Why do you spend so much time in the basement? My brother, Michael, asked one evening. He had started dropping by more often. A silent guardian against my growing isolation. I'm working on something important. He sighed, rubbing his hands together as if weighing his next words. You've been different since they died. I get it. I do. But this isn't healthy. I didn't answer. I couldn't tell him. He wouldn't understand. He had a wife, kids, a life that didn't revolve around a grief that gnawed at the edges of his soul. If only I could fix it. The day I finally did it, the day I stood on the sidewalk and saw her again, was the happiest of my life. There she was, my wife, holding our daughter's tiny hand. Her laughter a melody I thought I had lost forever. I felt the weight of the world lift from my shoulders. This was it. This was my moment. I stepped forward. Reality cracked. The world shuddered. The air around me turned thick, viscous. My vision doubled, tripled. My hands were not my own. Too many fingers. Too few. My wife turned to me. But her face was wrong. Her eyes were dark pools, reflections of something vast and unknowable. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I ran. I fled back to my machine, back to the basement, back to the safety of knowing I had control. But I didn't stop. I told myself I could fix it. I had simply gone too far. I needed to refine my method. I needed to try again. The addiction set in quietly, like ivy creeping up an old house. One more trip, I told myself. One more adjustment. I could make things perfect. I could make them stay. But time had other plans. I started to lose myself. The jumps blurred together. My hands looked wrong in the mirror. Elongated. Too many knuckles. My memories became fractured. Had I spoken to Michael yesterday or last week? Had I eaten today? Did I even exist in this moment? Or had I left pieces of myself scattered through time? And then, one day, I looked in the mirror and did not recognize the thing staring back at me. The machine groaned, its wires fraying like the unraveling edges of my mind. I no longer used notebooks. I simply knew where I was going. Or at least, I thought I did. I had to escape. Forward. I would go forward. I would travel until I found a point where I could reset it all, where I couldn't do every mistake, every ripple, every tear in the fabric of time that I had caused. I stepped into the machine one final time. The universe decayed around me. The stars died, one by one, until I floated in a sea of cold nothingness. My body dissolved and slowly emerged back from the lost dust that came from the stars. Time collapsed, pulled inward, folding over itself like the closing of a book. And then, light, the birth of everything. I watched as galaxies formed, as the first sparks of life flickered into existence. I drifted through eons, nameless, faceless, waiting for the moment I had aimed for, the moment where I could step in and finally make things right. But something was wrong. I reached my home, my past, my life. I saw them. My wife, my daughter, Michael. He was there, in my house, drinking with my wife and hugging a little boy. Who was that boy? I wanted to reach out, tap the window and talk to my family, but they did not recognize me. I was but shadow, a whisper, a human being outside of time. I had become something else, something forgotten. I wanted to scream, but there was no voice left in me. I wanted to cry, but tears were not forming. I wanted to explain everything, but then I understood. I had never truly left. I had always been here, watching, reaching, failing, a ghost of my own making, a prisoner of my own obsession. I didn't exist. Maybe I never had. And yet I'm here, being the appendage that the universe has not removed yet. The miscalculation on a perfect equation that is reality. The aborted element from time. I am nothing. For me, this whole experience took approximately a few days, maybe even weeks. I witnessed the horror of the downfall of societies, the destruction of stars and the rebirth from nothing of the universe. I forgot my wife and daughter's names. My brother's name is the only I remember now. I don't really know why. I used to think that traveling across time would be what would save me from the unending horror that is losing everyone you once loved. It is now, as I write this, trying to live in a strange world that looks almost exactly as the one I left eons ago, that I finally understand that time is not the solution to horror. Time is the horror.